Hey, what's up everybody? It's LeeLos, and today we're talking about why Hisoka versus Razor is complex. Stay steady in pursuit of your dreams and goals. You're born to win, you're made for greatness, and I definitely believe in you guys. Keep up the great work each and every day. So this video is meant to be a sequel to the video I made yesterday called Hisoka vs. Razor is Obvious. So if you haven't seen that video, I recommend watching that one first, because this video will be going in detail about the previous video. Okay, so that's the spoiler warning. Let's get started with talking about this video. So after reading a few things that people were saying about the video, it seems that a few points were either disagreed with or possibly maybe even just misunderstood about the Hisoka versus Razor fight. So we'll be using this video to go in detail about different counter arguments to the points from the previous video, and going more in detail about the different possibilities in the Hisoka versus Razor fight. So first off, one of the main complaints I was seeing are people saying, even though I think Hisoka will win, the fight would be closer than you're saying it is. This is a fair critique, so let's go more in detail and talk about this. So throughout the video, I say on 3 separate occasions that it would be a high difficulty fight. At this timestamp I say it's a very high difficulty, and here I say that it's extreme difficulty. Furthermore, I also say why it would be high difficulty is because you can make the argument that Razor has a higher aura output than Hisoka, or you could argue that he just has a stronger body than Hisoka. And in the video, I say that Hisoka might not even be able to hurt Razor while Razor uses his Nen defense at full power. When I made that in the video initially, I thought that this expressed the idea that Razor was physically stronger and they both have possible win conditions over each other. I'm thinking now that maybe I should have said a bit more, so I wanted to do that here. To clarify, what I mean by these points is the following. There's a strong argument that Razor is physically stronger than Hisoka is. Hisoka versus Razor would be a very high difficulty battle. Both of them have win conditions over each other, and you can honestly just straight up argue that Razor in general has more strength than Hisoka. But in a Nen battle, strength is not the only thing that matters. There are many different factors and elements that go into a Nen battle. We see many times throughout the series, such as Morel versus Chi-Tu and the Palace Hunters versus the Royal Guard, that even if a character has a stat disadvantage, they can still win the battle. There's also a line of dialogue in which Knuckles states fighting people with unprecedented power wasn't even a rare occurrence to him. In Hunter x Hunter, even if someone is physically stronger than their opponent, it doesn't automatically guarantee that they're going to win the fight. Furthermore, I initially thought that I had expressed the idea that Razor might have a higher aura output than Hisoka, but let me use this as an opportunity to go more in detail about that. So there's a real argument that Razor's aura output is higher than Hisoka's, which is why I was saying that you could argue that Hisoka might not be able to damage Razor while Razor's Nen defense is at full power, which is why I was saying Hisoka's best chance at victory would be landing a sneak attack on Razor. Now, even though I had said a few times throughout the video that it would be a high difficulty fight, it seems that it was coming across as if I was saying it would be a low difficulty fight. So let me clarify that now, and then we'll go into the next counterpoint. My main argument is the following. If you say that Razor's actually powering Greed Island with his own aura, then Razor is just going to beat Hisoka. He would be unquantifiably stronger than the Razor we saw in the actual Greed Island arc. He would be insane. Powering all of Greed Island with his own aura would just be one of the most impressive feats in all of Hunter x Hunter. He would be overall considerably more likely to win against Hisoka. He would just be too powerful of a character. However, if you say that Razor is not powering Greed Island with his aura, then Hisoka versus Razor would be a very high difficulty fight. You could argue that it could go either way. There's arguments for either one winning. Both sides have win conditions. However, Hisoka's win conditions are slightly more likely based on what we've seen so far in the series. That was the main point in the previous video as well. So let's talk about that in more detail now. So when I say they both have win conditions, what do I mean by that? I mean both sides have a real possibility of defeating the other. Razor does have possible situations where if he does these exact list of actions, he can defeat Hisoka. And the same applies for Hisoka. If he follows an exact list of actions, he can defeat Razor. But when I say it's slightly slightly more likely for Hisoka to win. What do I mean by that? I mean, Hisoka's displayed moveset and abilities has a higher probability of success achieving a possible win condition against Razor than Razor's displayed moveset and abilities would have at achieving success at a possible win condition against Hisoka. Or in other words, arguing that Hisoka would win requires less assumptions than arguments for Razor winning. So now let's really go more in detail and talk about this, the different win conditions for both characters, and the arguments you would have to make for the win conditions. I think the argument I made that people really disliked was me saying it's challenging to make an argument that Razor can land an attack on Hisoka in a 1v1 based on what he's displayed in this dodgeball game. So let's talk about that. Let's actually do that now and try to make an argument for Razor landing an attack on Hisoka. Let's walk through this argument step by step, form counterpoints to it, so that way it will paint a clearer picture of what I was referring to. So for example, let's say Razor can land an attack on Hisoka in a 1v1, and someone counters by saying, okay, we'll prove that. We see that characters far weaker than Hisoka, like Gon, are clearly able to react to this attack from Razor. This is after Razor states he will not hold back against Gon, and he says that the volleyball will be just as powerful as his Hatsu ability. Yet we see Gon not only just visibly react to the attack, but he changes from Ken to Ko and moves his arms in position to try and catch the dodgeball, all while the ball is flying through the air after Razor throws it. On top of this, Tesgera reacts to it and tells Gon he should dodge the attack. So not only are we seeing a character considerably weaker than Hisoka react to this ability after it's already in the air, but we're also seeing characters like Tesgera say that he thinks Gon can dodge it, and these are people far weaker than Hisoka. So if characters far weaker than Hisoka are able to react to this attack, and I mean we also see people like Killua dodge it as well, if all of this is happening, how could an attack like this hit Hisoka? This is where you would actually have to try and argue that Razor could pull this off somehow. And this is where it gets genuinely challenging. You could say something like, just because Gon could react to it doesn't mean Hisoka can, but that's not a very good argument because Gon is a lot weaker than Hisoka. Then you could say something like, well, just because Gon is reacting to it and applying multiple Nen techniques all before the ball hits him, and Tesgera says that he could dodge it, and Killua was able to dodge the dodgeball as well, doesn't necessarily mean Gon could dodge it. And it's like, you see what I'm saying? Arguments like this, they're really tough to make. It almost feels like being dishonest when making the argument. You could also say something like, well, maybe Razor using his Hatsu ability 14 Devils would increase his chances at landing an attack on Hisoka. And a counter argument to that would be, well, we also see that Gon and Killua are still able to follow the volley attack from Razor passing around the ball to his Nen beasts at fast speed. Gon and Killua are still able to follow it the entire time, and they tell Tesgera where it is before the ball even hits him. So again, this is showing Gon and Killua reacting to the Nen beasts, and they're considerably weaker than Hisoka. They're weaker than base form Hisoka. When Hisoka uses his bungee gum to amplify his speed, he would be even faster than that. And then it's like, okay, well, how do I argue against that? Another argument you could make is, well, maybe if he used all 14 of his devils, then the combination would be more complex. And then a counter argument to that is, well, him using more devils, they might actually get weaker. For example, 14 devils could be his maximum that he can create at one given point in time, but during the dodgeball game, Razor made 7 devils. So you could argue, if he made a total of 14 devils, the amount of aura that went into the 7 would just be split in half given to 14, so the ball could be even slower as a result. There's a real possibility of that. Or you could argue that Razor was holding back when he used the 7 devils. He didn't put his full power into the 7, but that goes against what he says to Gon at the start of the dodgeball game. He tells Gon that he's not going to hold back. So far, I've listed a few arguments for how Razor could land an attack on Hisoka, and all of them have valid counter arguments. But let's keep going and let's keep trying. You could also say, if they weren't in a dodgeball game and they were actually fighting, Razor could use his hand-to-hand fighting ability and make it easier to land attacks on Hisoka that way. For example, maybe Razor could run up and box with Hisoka while the Nen-Beast are throwing Razor's Hatsu ability volleyball at him. So a counter argument would be be, can you prove that Razor in hand-to-hand is faster than his volleyball is? And then it's like, well, really, how do you prove that? Razor is actually an emitter, so his emitter technique should be stronger than what his hand-to-hand would be in theory. It might even be up to 20% stronger. His emitter attacks might be 20% stronger than his hand-to-hand. So his hand-to-hand genuinely might be slower than his actual volleyball throw or his spike. And the spike is considered to be his true strength, an ability he says he didn't even think he would need to use, even though he said he wasn't going to hold back on Gon. That is a real challenging argument to make. Can you argue that Razor in hand-to-hand is actually faster than his spike or his normal Hatsu ability, both of which characters weaker than Hisoka are able to react to? Let's try and argue that a bit more. Then maybe you could say something like, well, he fought Jing, so that means his physicals are really powerful. And at this point, we're starting to reach the headcanon territory. It's like, okay, well, can you prove he only used his physicals against Jing? He might have used his Hatsu ability back then too. Can you prove when he developed it? You see what I'm saying? There's a lot of counter arguments to these things. But let me keep trying. You could say that Bisky says that Razor is really strong. Since Bisky says that Razor's really strong and doesn't exactly say that about Hisoka, maybe that means Bisky thinks Razor is stronger than Hisoka is. And with that additional physical strength buff, maybe that would make up for the 20% decrease from emission abilities to enhancer abilities. And it could make it so that he outpaces Hisoka in hand-to-hand. I'm really trying, but you're starting to reach a point where it's just so challenging to prove that he can even land a hit on this guy, which is what I was saying in the video initially. Genuinely hard to argue it. I'll keep trying though. Maybe you could make some kind of connection between how Killua is able to beat Gon in the jumping contest and maybe connect that to Razor somehow, and you could make an argument that even though he's more proficient in emission, he's somehow faster in hand-to-hand due to his physical strength. Maybe you could make some kind of argument like that, but I'm gonna be honest with you, at that point it is becoming kind of a stretch. Maybe you could make an argument somehow saying, you know what, because Razor's body is physically strong, his hand-to-hand, it would be even faster than his Hatsu ability, it would be even faster than his spike. Even though his spike is said to be his true power and he's an emitter, his hand-to-hand is actually where it's actually his true strength. Like his hand-to-hand, even though it's not stated, him running up and boxing people would be faster and stronger than his Hatsu ability. You would have to make arguments like that. And maybe you could say something like, oh, well, we saw him reflect a rock level attack with his physicals, so that means maybe he could apply that to his speed, and maybe he could make himself dozens of times faster by applying that aura to his feet, because we see that rock is stated to be dozens of times stronger. So maybe he could make his feet like dozens of times faster and he could blitz Hisoka like that. So these are the kind of arguments that you kind of have to make to say that Razor can land an attack on base form Hisoka. It gets pretty challenging, right? Meanwhile, with Hisoka, all you have to say is, well, for Hisoka to win, he needs to land a few off-guard attacks against Razor, which is something that Hisoka does in pretty much every single fight we've ever seen that Hisoka has. Also, a character far weaker than Hisoka, Gorenu, lands an off-guard attack on Razor during the dodgeball game. So it's a far easier argument to say Hisoka is slightly more likely to achieve the same feat that Gorenu did than it is to say Razor, in his base physicals, enhancing his base physicals, would be faster than his Hatsu ability because he's really big and strong. That is a harder argument to make than to simply say, I think Hisoka has a higher chance at performing the same feat Gorenu did a few times and winning the fight that way. Let me continue trying to argue that Razor could land a hit on Hisoka in a 1v1. You could argue that with a sneak attack in the team setting of the dodgeball game, Razor was able to make Hisoka block one attack, so this shows he can at least make contact with Hisoka. A counter-argument to that would be, there's three big elements that make this not a very strong point for a 1v1. First off, this took place in a team setting of a dodgeball game where Hisoka was standing there waiting for Razor to attack while Hisoka's not doing any counterattacks of his own. Second, it was a double surprise attack where it was initially designed to look like it was aiming at Killua, but really it was aiming at Hisoka. And third, Hisoka still dodges the sneak attack and blocks the second sneak attack as well with his base physicals. physicals. These three factors are not present in a 1v1. First off, the first point, in a real fight, Hisoka doesn't have to stand there waiting for Razor to attack him. He can counterattack himself, making it harder for this situation to occur anyway. Second, Killua would not be there in a 1v1. From Hisoka's standpoint, he didn't even need to move or react until the ball was right in front of him, and the sneak attack was already happening. From Hisoka's perspective, you could argue he thought that the attack was just designed to hit Killua. In a 1v1 fight, this is not a factor. Every attack, he knows the end result is that it's designed for him. So you could argue that it was a last-second dodge Hisoka performed off guard. Meanwhile, in a 1v1, you would have to prove that he could be off guarded by an attack in a 1v1. That is a different thing than Hisoka being off guarded by an attack when it's initially designed to go after his teammate. You would have to prove that he could be off guarded in an attack where it's just Hisoka versus Razor. Third, the fact that Hisoka reacts to it twice with his base physicals is a pretty strong counterpoint, because using bungee gum to increase his speed, because we see in Hisoka versus Chrollo and Hisoka versus Goto, it's heavily implied that he's using the bungee gum to avoid attacks that he would not be able to avoid otherwise with his base physicals. So if he's able to avoid and react to these things while off guard with his base physicals, what proof is there that Razor could land this attack on him in a 1v1 while he uses bungee gum to go even faster? It becomes pretty challenging. So maybe then you could argue Razor, using his own devils, could create a diversion similar to the one that he performed against Killua. Maybe he could trick Hisoka into thinking that he's attacking one of his own devils, but then it's really a sneak attack to attack Hisoka. But then the counter is, why would someone as intelligent as Hisoka think that Razor's attacking his own Nen Beast when that would not benefit Razor in any way? Then maybe you could counter and say, well, maybe Razor could attack one of his Nen Beasts at the beginning of the fight to get Hisoka to drop his guard and make Hisoka think that Razor will randomly attack his devils every now and then he fakes Hisoka out by pretending to attack his devil the second time, and then it veers towards Hisoka last moment. Then if Hisoka chooses not to use his bungee gum escape, they could land an attack on Hisoka and kill him. If that ball thrown by the Nen Beast at the end was actually thrown by Razor at the end instead, they could kill Hisoka there, as long as Hisoka doesn't use his bungee gum escape. And then it's like, okay, well, if he does use his bungee gum escape, what happens? It's like, can you prove that Razor at point blank would still be able to hit him? At this point, I think you could say, if Hisoka does not use his bungee gum escape here to amp his speed, then they could potentially kill Hisoka with this plan. This is a possible win condition for Razor here, as long as Hisoka does not use his bungee gum to increase his speed and escape the attack. Now let's really analyze the argument I just made here. I've essentially said, based on what we've seen in the series, in order for Razor to land one attack on Hisoka, he would have to do something that he never displayed in the series, which is attack his own Nen Beast to get Hisoka to lower his guard. First off, that's something Razor's never done in the series, but he would have to do that. Then, once Hisoka's guard is lowered, then he would have to do the exact same trick he did in the story, pretend to throw his Hatsu at one of his Nen Beasts, and then curve it last second to attack Hisoka. And Hisoka needs to be standing still off guard the whole time, and Hisoka cannot use his bungee gum escape. And then Razor himself needs to appear at the last moment instead of the Nen Beast and throw the ball himself to kill Hisoka. Also, it was stated that Hisoka blocked that attack without using Ko, so if he used Ko, it could have been different. All that being said, this is the kind of argument that you have to make in order to say that Razor can land one attack on Hisoka. Like I said, he has possible win conditions, but they are simply harder to argue, because if I simply say, well, what happens if Hisoka just uses his bungee gum escape, then even this one win condition that I've spent a good amount of time explaining is still debatable. Would it actually really land? And if Hisoka's counterattacking the entire time, does the scenario even happen? That is essentially what I meant when I said that they both have win conditions, but Hisoka's are slightly more likely. What I've spent time here explaining is the length of argument you need to explain how Razor could potentially land an attack on a full power Hisoka and kill him, which requires you arguing Razor doing a few things that he's never been shown doing in the series before. Meanwhile, with Hisoka, You simply have to say, we saw that a character weaker than Hisoka was able to land a sneak attack on Razor, so therefore someone like Hisoka likely can do the same thing during a fight while going at full power, which is a much easier and simpler argument to make, especially since Hisoka has displayed himself doing this in multiple other fights. That was the main point of the video, but it seemed like I needed to go more in detail on it, so that's what I wanted this video to be for. Now, another big counter argument overall, there is a point I was trying to make about explaining ideal environments in Hunter x Hunter. I haven't explained this concept in other videos before, and it seems I needed to give more detail on it, so let me do that now. I'm not saying that Razor would only be strong in a dodgeball game environment. I'm saying there are ideal environments where characters become stronger. For example, Razor, he can be strong pretty much anywhere. If he's fighting outside, if he's fighting in a dodgeball game, if he's fighting where there's a lot of trees, he's still a powerful Nen user in all of these environments. But you could argue there's an environment where Razor would be his strongest. It's easier to see with characters like Hisoka, where Hisoka would be his strongest in an environment where he can attach his bungee gum to either the ceiling or trees or some kind of object around him in order to increase his speed. This environment would make Hisoka stronger than an environment where it's a completely open area with no trees, no building, no roof of any kind, because in an environment like that, Hisoka would not be able to use his bungee gum to increase his speed. Well, you could argue that maybe he could still somewhat do this by attaching his bungee gum to some point on the floor and then using it to kind of pull himself away, but that's more debatable. He kind of does something like this in his fight against Crollo. It's a bit more debatable if Hisoka could do this to himself. Now, another big counter argument overall is people say they needed Jing in order to defeat Razor, so that means that Razor is really powerful. This is also debatable, and you could also argue just because Jing defeated him doesn't mean that Jing was required. There could have been weaker hunters capable of capturing Razor at that time. We see Jing fight really weak characters in story already, and he's known for someone who has a insane reputation from doing a lot of crazy stunts over the years. You could argue that this was simply another one of Jing's crazy stunts that he performed. You could argue Jing wasn't even hired for this. This was simply something he did because he was bored or just wanted to have fun. The Hunter Association around 12 years ago being too weak, average hunters being too weak to capture Razor really isn't that big of a deal. There's a lot of characters that aren't that crazy that are also above the average hunter level. During the election arc, we see Hisoka kills numerous hunters. I think another big point would be something that was also spoken about in the initial video, the concept of Razor powering all of Greed Island. As I said in the initial video, and I've said in this one as well, that if Razor actually is powering Greed Island with his own aura, then yes, he's going to defeat Hisoka. I actually state that Razor powering Greed Island with his own aura is a highball interpretation of Razor, because what Razor actually says is he makes the spells work. He doesn't word for word say he powers them. So you could argue that it's just some form of technology. It's never confirmed that the spell cards are actually aura or a Hatsu ability of any kind. So there's a real possibility that it's just some kind of advanced technology that they've put together. But this was the main point of the initial video. It is a very close, very high difficulty fight that could go either way, but Hisoka's win conditions are slightly more likely than Razor's win conditions. You could also argue that maybe the winner is determined by who has a better environmental advantage. For example, if they're fighting in a completely flat area with no trees, nothing to maneuver around, no roof or ceiling, then Hisoka is just simply more likely to lose because he wouldn't be able to use his bungee gum to fly around and escape things quite as easily. So you could argue that they're so close in power that the winner is determined by who has their ideal environment. If Hisoka is fighting indoors or he's fighting in an area with trees, then he would be slightly more likely to win. But if they're fighting in a completely flat area with no trees, no buildings, nothing for Hisoka to use his bungee gum to move around and dodge attacks using his bungee gum to enhance his speed, then Razor would be slightly more likely to win. One more possible argument, maybe you could argue Razor could potentially land a sneak attack on Hisoka by turning his Hatsu ability invisible with Een and then hitting Hisoka with an invisible attack. But the counter argument to that would be, well, Razor's Hatsu ability is very telegraphed. It's literally like he's creating a volleyball and throwing it. So even if he made that invisible with Een and then threw it, Hisoka would see he's like throwing something at him. And if it looks invisible, Hisoka's likely going to use Gyo to see through that. The other thing, we never see Razor actually use Een, so again, that would be us assuming Razor can do something that he's never shown. That might not even be in character for Razor to fight that way. But you could argue that, well, since Kurapika knew Een, maybe Razor knows Een as well. But again, we never see him do this, and it genuinely might not even be in character for Razor to do something like that. Or maybe you could argue that after he throws his Hatsu, he could then turn it invisible. Then you'd have to argue that the Nen beasts can use Gyo, which that's debatable too. Maybe they can. Because imagine he turns the volleyball invisible and the Nen beasts are trying to volley it, but the Nen beast can't see it because it's invisible and he just one-shots his Nen beast with it. That's one possibility. Another thing is there's an argument that Razor using his actual Hatsu ability, the Hatsu ability explodes. That is also very debatable because in the manga, because the only time we see it create a explosion is when Razor uses it to destroy a boat. And you could argue the boat is just exploding from being destroyed by this Hatsu attack. When he kills his teammate using it, his teammate doesn't explode. The anime censors it and makes it look like he explodes, but in the manga, it actually looks like it just tears through his head. It might not actually be an explosion. It genuinely might just be a ball of aura similar to Gon's paper, but just a lot more powerful. Also, another thing to consider, if Razor's Hatsu ability actually does explode, that might limit a big portion of his moveset. For example, would he even be able to pass the aura ball around with his Nen beasts, or would they just explode? Like, would the Nen beast just explode trying to pass the attack? That's something to consider. It's a real possibility he just wouldn't be able to do that anymore if his Hatsu ability actually explodes. Another thing to mention is if you include the game master cards that Razor has due to being one of the game masters for Greed Island, then he can just battlefield remove Hisoka and win that way instantly. The thing about these cards, we don't know any limitation to them. He might just be able to do that to anyone, and in theory it could allow him to defeat characters way stronger than him as long as they fight him in Greed Island. For example, like the Royal Guard and Meruem, maybe Razor could just remove them as well using his cards. This could create more of an argument for Greed Island being Razor's ideal environment where he's at his strongest. But for this video, I was focusing on Razor fighting Hisoka without using the spell cards, because the spell cards, in theory, you could argue it would make Razor technically like the strongest character in all of Hunter x Hunter. It could allow him to potentially remove anyone from Greed Island, whether it be Meruem, the Royal Guard, Netero. He might be able to use these cards on all of them as long as they're in Greed Island. But this is more of a debatable thing. So yes, if he uses the cards, he can instantly remove Hisoka. Also, the card does say that it works on people who trespass Greed Island. So you could argue if characters like Netero or the Royal Guard entered Greed Island properly, then maybe this card would not work on them. Also, you could debate about, is there a limited number of uses on the spell card? And this does bring up one other counterpoint. People can argue that Jing wouldn't hire Razor if he could be defeated, but you could argue that the existence of these cards could be used to argue otherwise. You could say the reason Razor has cards like this implies that there's characters he cannot defeat. Otherwise, why would he need the cards? That's another kind of argument you can make. And another argument is, can he even use these cards outside of Greed Island in any way? So there's a lot of interesting arguments around these cards. But in this video, I wanted to focus on who would win a fight without including spell cards. But yeah, that's everything I wanted to say. A very close fight. It really could go either way because the characters are very close in power. But yeah, that's everything I wanted to say. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate the views and the comments. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.